both the culture and the ethnic group, are one of the three largest groups in Nigeria. Concentrated in the southwestern region of the country, the main cities for the Yoruba are the cities of Ile-Ife, Ijebu, and Oyo. Now, what's interesting about the Yoruba, in opposition to just about every other culture we've learned about so far, is that they are actually still alive. Generally the same traditions and culture, although with a wonderful Christian and Islamic twist thanks to colonialism, and has managed to survive in some capacity ever since their first city was founded. Now, to fully understand the Yoruba people, it would be easiest to focus on said first city, Ife or Ile-Ife, and how it came to be founded approximately 2,500 years ago. So, to keep this short and simple, since in theory you should have either read or be about to read this anyways, Golden Boy of Heaven, Obatala, gets bored of seeing nothing but sky and water everywhere, and after receiving permission from number one sky dad Olaroon, our boy Tala sets off to make the land and the humans, following his prophetic brother Orunmila's visions, of course. The place where Tala and his cat set up shop is henceforth known as Ife, and the humans that were made in Obatala's image, at least when he was sober, were the Yoruba. From that spot, humanity built Ife, or Ile-Ife, into the sprawling, technologically advanced city that it was later renowned for. All those dudes with O names, who you might consider gods at first glance, weren't exactly your typical gods. They were called another name that starts with an O, how surprising, the Orisha, or the Ariza, or the Arixa, depending on region. Orisha were all spiritual aspects of the head deity, Ororun, for which his three manifestations are Olonrun, Olonmer, and Olofi, one of which you'll recognize from earlier, and they were sent to Earth in order to help humanity. That could be through guiding them, or by assimilating into their culture in order to lead them. Because of this process, if an ancestor was super rad and hip and cool, their descendants would worship them like an Orisha for their contributions to humanity. As well as celebrating the past achievements of their ancestors, the Yoruba also celebrated how Orisha impacted their daily lives. They worshipped them primarily through festivals and art, as well as through non-blood sacrifices and their architecture. The festivals were vibrant and music-filled affairs. I'll go more in depth on that in a bit. The stories of the Orisha have survived for so many generations, not due to written literature, but through spoken word. Much like many other parts of Africa, oral tradition was how stories were spread from generation to generation. From parent to child, yes, but it was also more of a formal and public affair. Storytelling was a profession, and the kind of storyteller would usually dictate what kind of story they told, and how they were able to tell it. Storytellers like the one I'm showing here were able to animatedly pass down all sorts of culturally relevant stories, not just those of the Orisha. Other such stories that got passed down were stories of heroes and stories of folktales. One popular folktale character, the tortoise Ijapa, was the epitome of what traits not to show within oneself. An example of one such story is when Ijapa took advantage of the rabbit Ihoro's kind generosity towards food and attempted to take more than he deserved through means of trickery. As a consequence, when Ihoro's mother made moves to stop him, Ijapa fell from the sky and had his shell shattered and fractured like a jigsaw puzzle. Stories like this helped uphold the social order of what traits were and weren't acceptable in society. Oral storytelling ensured their culture survived and was passed down. Culture was especially prevalent in Ile-Ife. As the epicenter of the Yoruba people, it was seen as the most culturally rich and religious city for their culture. One thing you probably have guessed by now about Ile-Ife is that it wasn't actually founded by an Orisha. Now, this assumption is partially true, but is also technically false. The first people to live on Yoruba land were called the Igbo. They vibed for a bit and then were stomped out of there by some Chad named Oduduwa, who then established himself and his people there as the Igbo fled eastwards. There, Oduduwa founded Ile-Ife.
Now you may be wondering how the city was technically founded by an Orisha when I just described it being made by an actual real dude. See, it all ties back to that whole worshipping of the ancestors thing. Since Oduduwa was so influential with establishing Ife, he was deified, not as the creator Orisha Obatala, but as himself, the Orisha Oduduwa, the founder of Ife and of humanity, instead of Obatala. In this version, apparently Oduduwa took the materials from a drunken, passed-out Obatala and did the job himself, which means that they were both technically the Orisha of the founding of humanity and of Ife. After his death, Oduduwa's literal human descendants spread, expanding the reach of the Yoruba and of their city-states. One of his sons, Aranyan, went to establish the second most prominent Yoruba city, Oyo, and became the first Oba, which is essentially the title of a monarch. Fun fact, their successor was deified into the Orisha of Thunder and Lightning. The Yoruba existed in a loose confederation of city-states, and still treated each other as independent settlements, despite their shared ethnicities and beliefs. Since the story for class focuses on the creation of Ife and thus the culture around it, I decided to follow that format and also primarily focus on Ile-Ife as well. However, when talking about the Yoruba settlements, I would be remiss not to talk about Oyo, the other primary Yoruba city-state. Oyo, as mentioned before, was founded by his descendant of Obaduduwa, in a story that includes a civil war of succession after the first Oba and a magical snake, and honestly, it's a tale for another day. What's important is that Oyo Ife had much more of a focus on militarization and organization, to the point where their second ever Oba got deposed for appearing to be too weak and spreading his power too thin. Oyo steadily grew into an inland power until the end of the 14th century, at which point the Nupe, led by some dude named Tosera, took over the city and governed it for like 80 years until they got it back. Later on in the 17th century, the Oyo would grow into an expansive empire, but that's far beyond our target time frame here. So while they were similar in terms of ethnicity and general religion, the Yoruba city-states differentiate themselves with how they ruled themselves. The cities were ruled by Obas, that pseudo-monarch I mentioned 20 seconds ago, that were chosen from their royal lineage by elders and chiefs, and they were advised by their Ovolyos. Yes, even more O-names, very riveting. In case you were wondering, it has something to do with Nigerian culture and naming conventions, but there doesn't appear to be any consensus on why they're exactly using the letter O.
While most of the city-states shared this general form of government, the amount of power each group had varied based on location. While the Oyo had what was essentially an absolute monarch because of their whole military focus, remember? Another city-state called Ijebu's elder council held majority of the political power over the Oba, who in that region was apparently elected, which is weird. Likely due to a lack of written sources, as previously mentioned, it's kind of hard to get a grasp on certain historical details, like how exactly that election process would have played out. It's also not very well known if the city-states ever went to all-out war with each other, but due to how close they were in terms of government and how vital they were to each other's trading, it's unlikely that they ever did. But we'll never know. The only wars we know about were that one Oyo civil war, and the external wars with foreign entities they had later on in the timeline, but that is, once again, beyond our target time frame here. That's enough talk about what's going on outside. Let's talk about what's going on inside. Life inside of the walls of Ile-Ife were bustling and colorful. There was trade and work and festivals and music and food. The Yoruba settlements such as Ife were surrounded on all sides by massive mud walls made of natural materials such as palm oil, which is a wonderful callback to how the first plant that was mythologically planted was indeed the palm tree. In fact, most of the Yoruba buildings were made of the natural materials like the palm tree. Further emphasizing their use of natural materials, the Yoruba also utilized natural materials for their art and their clothing. Notable materials used in their art, especially for religious purposes, include rarities such as bronze, ivory, terracotta, wood, glass, and more. Their use of these materials was unique, especially at the time, because of their advanced techniques in developing the materials into their art. Their style also tends to be more realism-based, which is prominently on display when you look at their bronze head busts. Art was also typically used in a capacity for showing off wealth, status, and the worship of the Orisha. Royalty would often commission grand works of art or architecture to be made and displayed around their home area to show off their status. The art also may have had minor ritualistic purposes. Clothing, meanwhile, was very colorful, more so when used for festivals or masquerades, and were made by weavers with colorful cotton, and often denoted social status as well. Social status and class were two different things to consider with the Yoruba. Class in terms of economics was not an important component to Yoruba life, since most people were arguably what we would consider nowadays to be middle class. But it was a different story in terms of social structure. One social status was determined by age, gender, family, and political role, where status was shown by flaunting physical power, prestige, and agricultural surplus. Being able to control the resources was a large flex for them. While Yoruba land, in very ancient times, is believed to have been matriarchal, by the time Ile-Ife came into prominence, they were an established patriarchy. The largest component of social status was age. Respecting the elders was a huge and unquestioning thing. Seniority is determined by the same factors as social status, with the added addition of priesthood being a large factor. Gender, as previously mentioned, also played a large role with determining social status, although not in the way you may be thinking. Labor was rigidly divided by gender, meaning that women worked separately and autonomously from their husbands. Typically, the men would farm and harvest, and their wives would be the ones who took their stock to the market to sell. Such crops that they would plant and then harvest and then sell included yams, various vegetables, bananas, and palm oil. On the topic of marriages and how they affected people, family arrangements are also slightly different in comparison to our modern Western ideas of how to keep up a family. Marriage, for example, wasn't viewed as a union of two people, but rather as two families. The aspiring husband, as was common in African culture, would pay the bride's family a bride price in order to win their favor to marry her. Men were also permitted to have multiple wives, despite the fact that women could only have one husband. The naming of any child within the extended family was seen as a sacred affair called the Oru, which I am not even going to attempt to pronounce fully. The parents, grandparents on both sides, and any close relatives all pitched in to give the child names, which were influenced by past ancestors because according to the Yoruba tradition, children were often seen as reincarnations of their ancestors, or the circumstances of the child's birth. The circumstances of said birth could range from anything to the weather to their hair. If a child was born with naturally knotted hair, very similar to dreadlocks, they were viewed as a holy blessing of a child that must be protected. No one, aside from their parents or a priest, were able to touch the child's hair. At puberty, the child could either become a priest or would shave their head, as was typical with most men at the time. Most children grew up to learn the trades of their parents or whatever was available to their status. It's unclear how much of these dynamics changed from settlement to settlement. Despite being one ethnic group, they did indeed grow apart in terms of their policies as time went on, but that's later on down the line. For our target time frame, 500 BCE to 1400 CE in case you forgot, they are split up, but what united the Yoruba, then and now, is their shared culture. The worship and celebration of the Orisha, while changing depending on time frame and location, still manages to happen all throughout history. Their music, festivities, names, all of these traditions were passed down since the ancient times. The stories they tell and manage to pass down from generation to generation help keep this rich culture alive. Perhaps what is most admirable of all, especially to our westernized writing-based brains, is that all of this manages to stay true even though the Yoruba didn't even use writing systems to record these things. They remembered these stories because they listened and they learned, which, when generalized like that, is a lesson that we could all do well to remember.